Something else that I think is really important, what we've been talking about in terms of getting out on these channels, is building a personal brand, and far too few executives understand the underlying value of that. Personal brand is a trust ledger, right? If we talk about trust, it's like, how many places can I find that this person is saying something interesting over time in a way that I agree with or that matters to the industry? If you aren't publishing in some way in this digital economy, then you're missing an opportunity to add to that trust ledger.
And this is Scaling Clean, the podcast for clean economy CEOs, investors, and the people who advise them. I'm your host, Melissa Baldwin. Each show, we bring you usable insights from tested leaders that you can apply to the business of running your business. What can you learn from 1,000 conversations with clean energy leaders? Nico Johnson can tell you. After more than a decade hosting the Suncast podcast, Nico's had a front row seat to the industry's most successful leaders building companies, making decisions, and communicating ideas. His team is digging into Suncast's massive catalog to pull out lessons and ideas that other leaders can apply to their own businesses. In this conversation, we talk about building trust, telling a better story, using AI to run a leaner business, and why clean energy leaders need to put themselves out there. Here's my conversation with Nico. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So, Nico, you've been running the Suncast podcast for over 10 years. You've spoken to over 1,000 people, and I want you to just kind of take a step back from that and tell me, what do you notice after all of these years? Are there any patterns that emerge in clean energy that somebody who is maybe working inside of one company might not see?
I definitely see patterns begin to emerge. And what I've found is that the story lags behind the company. What I mean by that is that a company often finds an early story that they sort of hang their work on, right? It works with investors, it gets early customers, they keep repeating that story. Meanwhile, internally, the product has changed, the customers have evolved, the economics maybe have changed, the real advantage of their business is changing. They don't necessarily tell the story of what they've actually become, let alone the story of where they're going. If you have an opportunity when the recording stops to start asking more questions, pulling out the stuff they're not willing to say on the screen, you find they've created an investor deck that maybe does tell that narrative. But internally in the company, certainly in the sales department, there's a weak message that is not necessarily a strategy or a copywriting problem. It is an alignment issue. I often say to executives, you've really got to be able to get ahead of this, which means you've got to slow down. You've got to become aware of the story you're telling. You have to have this story bank and have it be relevant across the various stakeholder groups. Technical teams often, they focus on product performance. That's a critical limiting factor that we try to overcome in marketing. But what is preventing scale for them is usually not technology, unless they're going through like technical readiness levels of like hard to scale products. But it's the story that's being told in the community about who they are. It's the permitting thresholds that are keeping their interconnection queue extremely long. It's customer education generally about the marketplace, not necessarily their product in the market. So the best product doesn't automatically give you the best company or the best win in the market. If it did, we'd all be using Betamax, and VHS would have died. Obviously, neither of those technologies have won out over digital.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I want to talk more about just this rich experience that you've gotten to have through doing all the interviews with Suncast. Is there any conversation that really changed your perspective on the future of clean energy?
I think the process of interviewing is a sales job because you have to figure out a way to line up enough no's to get to yeses. And a great example of that, I can't remember, I think it was episode 900 that we had TJ Rogers. TJ was, I've probably spent 3 or 4 years trying to get TJ on the show. He's a well-known Silicon Valley sort of icon, longest running publicly traded CEO in the United States, at least, I think in the world, with Cypress Semiconductor, a company he founded. He brought perspective to an understanding of like what it takes to really run a company. And TJ wrote in the 90s a manifesto, like a capitalist manifesto, that is as relevant today for operators as it was back then. That interview is a masterclass. We went through 3 hours with TJ where he kept pushing meetings back and telling folks that he was doing something more important at the moment, which I was really honored by. But he kept unpacking these sort of principles for building a business. And as someone who's trying to build a business, not just a channel, a marketing channel, I think that I learned a lot from that interview about how an industrialist thinks. The most important thing I took away from him in that conversation that I think is relevant for your audience is what KPIs he focuses on. One in particular that he said and has said many times is the most important metric is revenue per employee. We have the privilege of interviewing the select few who are succeeding. And what I've found is, what I learned from them is what the uncommon winners, the uncommon successful do. And when I have conversations with my friends and say, do you do this? The answer is most often, oh God, I know I need to. I know I need to slow down and think about that in my business. Going back in history to like conversations that ended up taking way longer to unpack, but they were worth it. Bill Nussey, I interviewed in December of 2021. It was right after I came back from Mexico. I spent like a day with him at his farm, at his lake house, Lake Hartwell. And
cool.
The Bill Nussey interview was 3 hours. We broke it up into 2 parts. He was one of the first people to sort of flag the battery revolution that was coming, and the momentum shift that storage would unlock. Just sort of business models that storage would unlock, like being able to build the kind of business that we still haven't seen surface yet, but it will, of like going around to different homes and like replacing battery systems that are rechargeable, right? Like, I don't know if you noticed this, but a few years ago, Duracell had promoted this idea that like that they had this battery that could be swappable, that literally like a battery that you put into your remote control, you could pop the one out and put another one in. Like, if we were in a world where batteries were that consumable for homes as they are in your VCR, in your remote controller, or in your whatever apparatus you have at home, then and if we assume that those batteries are being filled by distributed, meaning on site or near field, clean energy, whether that's district energy or your residential or building energy, and that solar is essentially free, then it unlocks business models, service models even, that we can't fathom today. And when he wrote the book, Freeing Energy, that was the premise. Still, to this day, like that book has such powerful knowledge transfer from a guy who had already built and sold 2 companies. He built a Marcom company that he sold, a Martech company he sold to IBM in in the aughts, I think. So this is the greatest advantage I've gotten. Even episode 101, the fundamentals of negotiating, it was called Negotiating 101. Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. All right, like some of the most valuable conversations I've gotten are folks who either are from outside the industry entirely or who have come into the industry from outside the industry and applied their learning to this industry. I could name over and over, like the John Perella interview that we just recently published in the spring, talks about the impact of hyperscaler data centers and how we need to reconsider the interface between the grid and a hyperscaler and how we manage that process and those electrons. Sheldon Kimber, over multiple conversations, has been revelatory in how will markets behave with clean energy as a fungible electron, the way that the oil industry has fungible molecules. What does it mean for the sort of the distribution system? How do we think about mating clean energy with traditional fossil fuels, right? Something like Intersect years ago got something right. I think Jigger just made a post on this, that the folks who can wait the longest to get paid will make the most value for the marketplace, rather than needing to negotiate the highest value contract up front, which also comes along with a whole bunch of other like qualifiers of like, can I be bankable? Can I get financing for this? Can you create a value proposition that allows others in the value stream to make money before you do? And then you have a high upside, or that allows you to get paid as close to when the electron's delivered as possible in the merchant market case, for example.
Can I interrupt you? Because you just said something and I want to ask more about. I'm really interested in this. I noticed, because one of the things we do is just look at how announcements are made and the series in which CEOs communicate to the marketplace. And your show is big enough. You have a good following. And what I noticed is that some CEOs actually use your show as a part of an announcement strategy. And I'm thinking in particular about Sheldon Kimber, because we were looking at we were researching just the acquisition of Google. Google acquired Intersect. Huge deal for our industry. And so I'm just curious to hear more about that. Like, do you get approached by CEOs who want to make a splash or who are looking to grow their name and visibility? Maybe even
Both.
somebody who is, yeah.
Yeah,
Say
both.
more about that.
I will. It became, so I was on the Trina Solar marketing team. I was the first field marketing manager. I watched how Trina became the #1 global brand for solar panels at a time when Chinese solar modules were both like, they were very, they were quickly becoming the most cost effective, but most people couldn't name one Chinese brand from another. Understanding how that messaging works and how the marketing teams think really helped me when I decided to create a messaging platform. So within months of launching Suncast, I was in the office at Enphase, for example, asking, like, presenting, here's how I think your marketing budget could be better used. And I understood how the marketing budget worked, how they think about the reach of their marketing dollar and marketing qualified leads and all that, right? So when I bring on a large, sort of the highly visible guest, one of the conversations that we have in the background before we do the episode is, hey, look, this is earned media and we do have some paid options. But the conversation is usually like, we have a queue. It's a rather long queue. I want to make sure that when we publish this, it's relevant to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? How can I help ensure that this aligns with something you've got coming? The number of conversations I've had that from there led to an NDA and them giving us more really deep detail around how they're bringing new products to market, et cetera, helped me build a communications team that is hyper aware of how our industry is growing and who are the market mavens and the market makers. So when someone like Sheldon, he didn't tell me, hey, we're going to sell the business. But I was among the first people that Kate and his team reached out to when the transaction happened. And what happened with Alphabet buying Intersect is a slightly different scenario. We've had probably 2 companies in the last 3-4 years who incorporate. I mean, I think the better story there is like how NextPower incorporated our work into their rebrand from NextTracker to NextPower.
Yep.
And that was very intentional. And it was a commercial relationship with NextPower that I'm really proud of. We helped tell that story as a part of this cross-channel strategy that Kristen Kirsch and the many wonderful folks that are on their team helped put together. Sheldon and Intersect being acquired is a great example of having a big enough body of work and a desire to be relevant that whether they say yes or not, I can still show up. So Sheldon said, hey man, I'm sorry, Alphabet won't let me talk about it. And I wrote to my editor, Chris, and I said, Chris, we just did an interview a year ago where Sheldon effectively said all the reasons I think underscore why they got acquired. Here's the press release. I think it basically answers the reasons. And we put together essentially like a Vox News style report on why Alphabet bought Intersect. And it was the #1, by a long shot, #1 piece of content that we produced in the first half of 2026. Kate and Sheldon both were like, man, this is really cool. Thanks for doing this. They didn't, in that case, didn't ask us to do it. They just said, no, we can't share. Alphabet won't let us talk about it yet. That was back in December, right? So I just said, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to do what most I learned from, I was never a reporter, I wasn't trained in journalism, but I've learned from the journalism industry. I was like, I'm going to newsjack, because Alphabet just bought one of the biggest newsjacking is when you take a news piece and you turn it into a story that you get credit for. Alphabet buying Intersect was by far the biggest announcement of that period in our industry. It was a huge nod towards how the clean energy industry has matured, and had this information that we had already published in a previous episode where Sheldon was basically giving the underlying plan for how he was going to walk a company like Alphabet down the aisle.
So you've had huge guests on your show, people like Sheldon Kimber, Bill Nussey, but there's a lot of startups in our industry, and there's probably a lot of folks out there who are in marketing who say, hey, I want to get my CEO on Nico's show. What advice do you have for people who want to book a guest on your show on how to be interesting?
The answer to what I'm looking for is, are they doing something remarkable? Is it sufficiently differentiated in the marketplace? Will this episode be evergreen? If I can ask the right questions and share this information, will 2 or 3 years from now someone find this interview as relevant as the day it was published? Meaning, you got to be working on an interesting problem. You got to be doing something that is visible. So companies coming out of stealth don't usually get my attention because they haven't done anything. And I've had over 900 plus episodes. I've had a dozen or so companies go bankrupt that I've interviewed their founder. And I don't regret those interviews, but I do try to avoid them at this point. If I can, I want it to be memorable industry leading companies and pioneers, or in the absence of that, are you doing something interesting and can bring to my audience something that is portable from wherever you came from, banking, healthcare, biotech, whatever it is. Like, is there some truth that you can share to the operators in this industry from somewhere you came from that we as an industry can adopt? I think the best guests are useful, not necessarily impressive. I'm not looking for press releases. I never have guests on simply because they're coming out with some new announcement. It has to be because they're already doing something useful that I think explains how the industry is evolving and gives people a few ideas they can apply immediately after the episode.
What I hear you saying is that the best guests are useful. And I think that's really important because across the work I've done, I think sometimes a lot of times people in a company might have a generic definition of marketing and communications, and they might lean into, I want to sell my stuff, let me talk about me. And the thing that we educate our clients to do is, it's not about you, it's about what interesting thing you have to say about the marketplace, or what you can teach the rest of the world, or like how can you demonstrate how proficient you are by your knowledge of something that other people don't know about.
I use the pre-interview to get someone to tell me all their corporate talking points so that I can avoid them in the interview.
Nice.
Also, there's a bias towards, if I've told you all this stuff in the pre-interview and we've gone deep on it, I, as the guest, can be tripped up psychologically and feel like, oh, I've already said that. And I want them to feel that way. I want them to feel like, ooh, have I already said that? The unspoken editing of curating the right guest. I have a meeting every week with my production team, and they present sort of the litany of emails that come in for people pitching. And I'll go through and filter who do I think has a good story. And that comes to the point of kind of what marketing teams do well or not, is pitching your executive to a podcast just because you have a new announcement or you've like taken on money or whatever. Like, most podcasts should not be interested in that. They should be interested in how you've thoughtfully approached my audience about helping my audience understand something they wouldn't otherwise understand if I didn't interview your person. I've been really grateful to a friend, Amy Tuck, who did like a survey of the industry's podcasts and revealed that there was less than 10% podcast guests in the industry that are female or people of color. Kind of looking through the clean energy podcast ecosystem. I circled back and said, hey, I know for a fact that my numbers are better than. She said, actually, yeah, sadly for the industry, Suncast pulls the average up. So we're roughly 1 in 5. My goal has been for a long time to be 30+% diversity and female executives in particular. And the industry reflects that. And that's one of those things. That's one of those areas where I think we could all be doing better as an industry. I see so many female guests who would be awesome at in an interview defer to their male counterparts or simply kick the can down the road. I have at least two I can think of right now who I've been chasing them for 2 years to schedule time. And unfortunately, the statistics underscore this. Men are way more aggressive at booking things like this and eager to do them, and women are not. And so I just want to encourage the women listening, please, this is an incredible way to both build your own brand value and brand your personal brand, but to allow the world to see that the company you work for, in particular, is the kind of company that has a diverse leadership. It's already well established that female companies with female leaders do better on Wall Street and other ways, have better cultures, etc. So like, we need to do a better job of demonstrating that leadership to the industry.
I appreciate you for saying that. As a female executive, I can relate to other female executives who may feel like, oh, I'm too busy, or, wondering. There's that imposter syndrome that I think a lot of people, male and female, can have. But I think that the other thing I recall that I found very poignant when I was at HubSpot's Inbound last year, Amy, I'll have to remember the name of the woman from SNL, Amy Poehler.
Oh, yeah.
Amy Poehler spoke. She was incredible, and she was very encouraging to the women in the audience. And now at HubSpot's Inbound, actually, the community there was heavily female because this is a marketing and communications conference.
Totally.
Whereas, like, when you go to ACP or RE+, you still have a higher concentration usually of males.
Yeah.
But Amy spoke to the audience, and she said a lot of times, every time she sees women in the room, they show up over-prepared, and yet they are the least likely to advocate for themselves.
Right.
And so you have this phenomenon where women are overqualified, overprepared, and underspoken. Like, they're not really stepping up. And so I think that that's true, not just in renewables industry, but across industries. And so I'm glad that you're trying to bring more voices in. I want to move now to investor readiness. This is something I know that you're working on. I've noticed even in the work that we're doing, we see a lot of companies coming to us who they don't just want to do marketing communications to sell more stuff. They actually want to market their company to investors and markets. And so I want to hear your perspective on how communicating to the investor audience is different than communicating to the customer audience.
I would argue that the way we do communicate as an industry is in many ways very sort of Wall Street investor focused. I don't know that our industry has a hard time communicating the core messages to investors. Investors are looking for the so what? Why do I care? What are you building? And how is it going to change the world? Depending on whether you're family office or venture or private equity, they're looking at very specific timelines, and you have to understand that audience. I mean, this is all about audience selection for various messaging. I don't know that I can give you within this time frame that we have like a cogent answer on the difference between customer focused messaging and investor focused messaging, but rather that I find far too many companies pitch only one message, and it tends to be that which they would tell an investor. Our industry has been in this cycle of like technology readiness for so long that CEOs are more often than not on investor calls trying to raise money the next round. And so they understand pretty well what it looks like to communicate to investors. But to turn around, I'll give you a great example. I won't mention names, but I got a predominantly tech-focused CEO, large battery company, who have raised many hundreds of millions of dollars on the phone with a bank that is not looking to invest, but potentially could put debt on their projects. And the CEO did kind of exactly what our friend Spencer calls pitch slapping. He spent most of the time going through a very detailed sort of technical demonstration of why they sort of deserve to exist. And I watched the banker's eyes just glass over. What he didn't say until way down in the conversation was not necessarily who this product was for, but who is saying yes to it. Like, where is it changing the narrative in a set of customers that is relevant to that audience, that banker. That banker had just done several battery projects. I don't know if it is something that is like company size, meaning you've got, a certain number in revenue, a certain number of employees, where internal comms teams begin to build these message pillars that are differentiated by market. It's something that I take for granted, having been at Trina, that like I didn't think was abnormal, because Mike Grunow, my boss there and longtime mentor, just was so good at building different communications, even like entire PowerPoint decks dedicated to, are we talking to a government official? Are we talking to an investor? Are we talking to a Trina customer? Are we talking to a prospect that is currently buying from a competitor? Knowing how to keep your core story sort of segmented. A distinguishing factor of most CEOs that I see who really succeed, like you'll point to Dan Sugar or Dean Solon as two examples that stand out to me. Mm-hmm. If you've ever gone to like more than 3 or 4 meetings with them, you hear the same story over and over. And I noticed this with a boss that I worked with over 3 different companies. I could tell his stories better than he could because I'd heard them so much. But every time we got in a dinner with a specific profile of sort of recipient, it landed exactly as we expected, right? He knew exactly when to deploy that asset to that listener. So my biggest encouragement for executives is build that story bank. And if you don't have it, like we've actually like developed a model we call a Store Map Workshop, where we go through a whole lot of just deep questions. You guys do this as well at TigerCom, that goes into like, what are the underlying stories that you want the world to believe about your business? Not just about who you are, but about why you exist and who you serve, and how, because you exist, their paradigm is going to shift in some meaningful way. Mark Kingsley, one of the boss I mentioned from Trina and then Alliant Energy, he said, if you can learn how your customer makes money and help them make more of it, they'll keep you around.
Yes, that's great. That's a great line. I want to talk about something you brought up briefly here. You talked about your story bank. AI is a huge topic right now for everybody. How are you using AI in your podcast or in your process at Suncast?
Yeah, I guess the answer is everywhere. I have built a project inside of ChatGPT where many hundreds of episodes live. I use AI to help me do research. Every person on my team is incentivized, has an account with either ChatGPT or multiples. I have a paid account with Grok, GPT, Claude, everything from researching the guest to ideating back and forth. Like, I don't do an episode now without a very specific prompt that I use in GPT with all the guest background and an entire document that Herman on my team creates for me that allows me to say, like, what should this interview flow try to accomplish? And what is the outcome that we want from this episode? And I've found, a lot of folks might say, well, that's just like you're leaning too hard on AI. My answer to that is the predecessors to me in the media industry leaned on a staff of 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 writers the way I lean on AI, right? So like we're a really small team of 5, and Herman does, lifts more than his weight on the production side because he uses Notebook LM, he uses Claude, he uses GPT, literally every piece of how we run this business. My goal, going back to TJ Rogers saying like revenue per employee, my goal is to build a $100 million business on 10 employees. Not because I don't want 50 employees, I'm not very good at managing people, but because I don't think with AI I need them. And I have this hope for and this vision for the ability for Suncast to become an intelligence layer for the industry in much the same way that Bloomberg and WoodMac and our friends over at Crux do a great job of this. But like, how do we extract value from real-time conversations without you, the executive, or someone on your team needing to listen to all these podcasts, watch all these videos, etc. Right? The only way we're going to do that is AI.
I thought exactly the same thing. It's like, gosh, we hear so many brilliant things from the executives we speak to. Like, can we make a wiki or do something?
Well, I have good news for you. Yeah. I have good news for you. In the next 3 months, I can do that for you, Melissa.
It's such a good idea.
Yeah, for your podcast and for mine. And for anybody else that's listening. Like, But I will bring this to market, so to speak. But like people in our power circle already benefit from it. Like we're testing it by sending around these things and saying like, is this valuable?
Nice. Well, I want to ask you, is there anything that you want to talk about that I didn't ask you about already?
Yeah, I think that we're at a time in our industry where we all recognize the rising tide lifts all boats. And if I feel like much more now than a year ago, it feels like a lot of folks are saying rightly, like, we got to get our message right. We got to talk to the right people. Jigger has said, we got to build this political power, things that like Tom Matzey is doing with building political coalition. Those are all important. And yet I find so many executives when they come on and we have conversations, and most of these are founders and C-suite executives, still feel alone. They still feel isolated in a world where like there's momentum, and if they find it hard to develop those peer relationships that can be relevant for them. And there just isn't or hasn't been a peer group like YPO or Entrepreneurs Organization or Vistage or Hampton. Like there's a bunch of this stuff that's sort of generic. I'm going to call them generic peer organizations that allow you to network with others in a closed room environment. And we're trying to think more critically about how do we provide an infrastructure for that layer of peer support and executive support for the industry. I'd love to have that conversation with any of the executives listening here, because I think that there are really meaningful ways that we can help connect you all to each other, but also, our networks are wide and diverse. Josh comes from family office, and so we spend a lot of time making introductions into family office and investor circles. For guests, it becomes something that I have now lately started offering, like if I find out they're raising money or whatever. I think that there's a question you asked earlier about investor readiness. I encourage anyone who is going to be raising money, like investors look for you in lots of different places before they'll actually come talk to you. And being a guest on a podcast is one of the best ways. And it doesn't have to be Suncast, because with AI and sort of AEO and SEO, like if I search your name and podcast, the interview will show up, whether it's YouTube or wherever it's published. So I just want to encourage, I think every CEO, every founder should have a podcast guesting strategy on their radar. If they can't get me to answer my email, they should be talking to you or Sean White or Tim Montague, or there's just a plethora in the industry, but also outside of the industry. We got one of our clients on Prof G podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts, right? Like nice. we need to elevate the game. Our industry has so much to say about the beneficial future we desire for our neighbors, and there's a lot of negative communication about whether or not our industry should exist and whether it offers value. Neither of those things should be questionable, candidly. The evidence is really plain and clear, and I want to embolden the folks that are listening to your show that you have something to say.
The clients that I have that have been incredibly successful have really run the laps and done the work of going around and having those podcast conversations. It's such a great way to build relationships, refine your message, and just get out there. And I agree, increase your visibility. And I want to say thank you to you, Nico, for including TigerCom in the Power Circle. And I think there's so much value in what you're doing and trying to bring people together. The curation that you do of those rooms is really valuable. I personally have benefited from the relationships that I've made in those events. So I want to say thank you to you for inviting me to those. And you are on to something smart with what you're doing in building community, because in the new AI world, that is what people seek. They seek connection, they seek community, they seek to be a part of something greater than themselves. And that's something that AI can't give them. So cheers to you for that.
Thank you for that. We refer to it as analog connection. And I like to say that revenue is downstream of trust. And in a digital world, that trust that trust bridge can start to be built virtually, but even still, it almost always, the foundations, the pillars of it that extend the bridge from one side to the other, that actually make the connection, are done in person. That's why people still go to all these conferences. It's why people get on a plane and fly to customers to have in-person meetings with them, even though we have perfectly capable Zoom and other technology platforms. So that, revenue is downstream of trust. I try to get in person with folks as often as possible. And I want to underscore something else that I think is really important. What we've been talking about in terms of getting out on these channels is building a personal brand, and far too few executives understand the underlying value of that. Personal brand is a trust ledger, right? If we talk about trust, it's like, how many places can I find that this person is saying something interesting over time in a way that I agree with or that matters to the industry? If you aren't publishing in some way in this digital economy, you're missing an opportunity to add to that trust ledger.
Brilliant. I love it. I want to take it. Thank you, Nico.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Scaling Clean, the podcast for clean economy CEOs, investors, and the people who advise them. I'm your host, Melissa Baldwin. Our producer is Claire Quirin. If you like what you hear on Scaling Clean episodes, we'd appreciate it if you'd give us a 5-star rating and leave a comment where you get your podcast. And until next time, we wish you all the best in the clean economy transition.